everybody. Thank you for coming. We'd like to extend you a very warm welcome to our first pre-conference symposium of New Directions 2020. I'm Christopher Redmond, the program chair for the New Directions Conference. Before I introduce our host today, I'd just like to remind you to please keep your microphones muted unless we tell you otherwise in a question and answer session. We will also be recording this symposium so that people who missed it can see it later. And if you have any problems during the symposium, for example, with audio, you can just leave a message in the chat box and we'll address it as quickly as possible. So without further ado, then, I will introduce today's symposium host, Dr. Vahid Aryadust. Vahid is an assistant professor at the National Institute of Education at Nanyang Technological University in Singapore. Vahid has led multiple language assessment projects funded both locally and internationally. He has also authored a number of journal articles, book chapters, and books with specific focus on neurocognitive mechanisms of language assessment, psychometrics, and state-of-the-art reviews. His most recent book is entitled Quantitative Data Analysis for Language Assessment, which is published in 2 volumes, published as well by Routledge. So with that, I'm going to hand over to Vahid to begin today's symposium. So over to you, Vahid.
Thank you very much, Chris, for the very kind introduction. I'm sharing my slides. Can you see that?
Yeah.
Yep. Good, wonderful. So good morning or afternoon or evening, everybody, because I suppose there are people who are not in our time zone. Thank you very much for attending this symposium, Eye Tracking and Language Assessment. I am Vahid Aryadust from the National Institute of Education of Nanyang Technological University, and I'm delighted to be the moderator for this wonderful event in eye tracking, which is one of the first events in its kind. So what I would like to do is to quickly walk you through what's going to happen in this symposium, the list of the presentations, and provide a very brief overview of eye tracking. I think it will be interesting for all of us because since this is a group that has a very specific interest in eye tracking. So we're going to have 4 presentations, starting by the one that Stacy and myself will present to you, which is about the gaze behaviors and test performance of native and non-native English-speaking candidates in a listening test. Then Franz Holzknecht will talk about using eye tracking in research on audio-only listening tests, and then Xiaoliu and Guoxing Yu will talk about exploring L2 learners, online processing of automated written corrective feedback, which is an eye tracking investigation. And finally, Ruslan Savarov will talk about investigating test-wiseness strategies in eye tracking using eye tracking technologies. What I would like to do here is to just quickly present some statistics about the use of eye tracking in our field, that's applied linguistics versus other fields of science. As you can see, this data is coming from Scopus. The use of eye tracking started in around 1962, as far as Scopus can tell us. I haven't cross-validated this with, for example, the Web of Science or Dimensions or other databases, but I suppose it's more or less the same story. So far, about 23,000 papers or books have been published with a focus on eye tracking technology, and the lion's share goes to computer sciences with more than 8,000 papers, followed by medicine, neuroscience, and psychology. Now, psychology is one of those fields in which we have adopted and adapted in language assessment in different ways, especially the theoretical frameworks that they have developed over time. It's interesting, therefore, to zoom in onto the field of psychology and its the application of eye tracking in psychology. As you see, it all started in 1969. Then there is a more or less flat period up until around 1999 and 2000. Then it starts to rise and it reaches its peak in 2020 with more than 4,500 publications in the field. But the picture in applied linguistics, that's the field in which all of us do our research and do our teaching. And of course, language assessment is quite different. We only have 90 documents, and that's quite small if you compare it with the rest of the sciences. And our interest in eye tracking started in 2003. There was a relatively flat period up until around 2013, around which there were increasingly more papers and publications on eye tracking, which, of course, if you look into the field of language assessment, you only find a handful of papers that have been published using the technology of eye tracking. Eye tracking has advantages and has promises, but also has limitations. And I'm hoping that in this symposium, we will talk about both advantages and of course, the limitations of the technique. Another thing that I would like to mention and just wrap up this brief introduction is, as you can see, our field is still young when it comes to eye tracking, and other technologies, of course. I hope that those of you who are looking for a research topic will consider implementing and integrating technologies in your research, because I think it will provide us with some sort of data which traditional or so-called conventional methods in the field of applied linguistics would not provide us with. Now, that brings me to the end of this brief introduction to eye tracking. There are just 4 house rules which I want to highlight before we start the presentations. Some of, I think two of them were just highlighted by Chris, but I would like to stress that every presentation is going to be about 15 minutes. So I hope all of us, because I'm also a presenter, all of us will keep that in mind. And I would also like to request the audience to write your questions in the chat box right at the bottom of the Zoom window if you look further down. That would be wonderful, because at the end of all 4 presentations, we will go through your questions and we'll ask all the presenters their relevant questions. And finally, before every presentation, I will provide a brief introduction to the presenters' backgrounds as well as their research. It's pretty brief, just to give you an idea who they are and where they're coming from. Thank you very much. With these preliminaries out of the way, let's now go to our first presentation, which incidentally happens to be Stacy and my own presentation with gaze behaviors and test performance. So what I would like to do first is to introduce Stacy. Chris kindly introduced me. So I think I just want to go through, just say a few words about Stacy and her research. Stacy Fu currently works for the National Cancer Center Singapore and has previously worked as a research assistant in the Department of English Language and Literature at the National Institute of Education. She holds a Bachelor of Science and began her research career in the field of clinical biomechanics and motor control, focusing on gaze behaviors and perceptual decision-making in Parkinson's disease. Her research interest surrounds understanding and establishing ecologically valid interpretations of human behaviors and performances across clinical, cognitive neuroscience, and neuromarketing domains. Thank you very much, Stacy. Over to you. By the way, as Stacy is presenting, I will also probably chime in occasionally if I have anything else to do, but actually she's going to take the lead in this presentation. Thank you very much. Over to you, Stacy.
Thanks, Mahit. Let's try and share my screen. Can everyone see my screen?
Yes, great.
Yeah.
Okay, so I'll just jump straight into listening comprehension test. So I'm sure every one of us would have taken some form of test in our lives, but did you know that there are different types of listening comprehension tests? So there are 2 main types of listening comprehension tests. One of it is while listening performance tests. So as the name suggests, candidates actually listen to the listening text and read and answer the test questions at the same time. An example of it would be the listening sections of the IELTS test, and as well as the CAEL, which is the Canadian Academic English Language Test. The post-listening performance test, okay? So what happens is that the candidates will listen to the audio text, and then they're followed by reading and answering of test questions only after they have listened to the audio text. So example of it would be the TOEFL. When we talk about this sort of test, I think majority of us would have think about non-native language speakers, but in fact, they are taken by native English speakers as well. And the bulk of the literature is primarily focused on post-listening performance tests. And the research has shown that native speakers outscored those non-native speakers. And what is interesting is that they found, Conrad found that native English speakers focus a lot on contextual semantic cues, whereby they make sense of a sentence based on surrounding information in a closed passage. Whereas for EL2 participants, they attend to things like word order and grammar. But what about WLP performance tests? Little is actually known about how native and non-native speakers compare against each other. And what do they actually focus on in a test? We don't know. But the bulk of the literature for WLP tests primarily is concerned with cognitive validity issues. So by that, we mean that do the cognitive processes used in a WLP test reflect that of those that are used in real life scenarios such as academic listening? So in terms of the cognitive validity test issues, so they are primarily focused on the different stages of listening comprehension in a test. So for pre-listening stages, it involves previewing of test questions. Whereas in a while listening stage, you listen to the audio text and you answer the test questions at the same time. For in the post-listening stage, it simply means after the listening audio text is played, you are just essentially checking your answers, ensuring that you are, as well as finishing up the listening test. Okay. So still actually question whether the wording and the words used and the order of the test items in the test can serve as visual cues to influence the way we search for things such as auditory information and visual information subsequently in the while listening stage. And indeed, EL1 and EL2 participants actually listen out for keywords in the audio text and match them against those that they have heard in the audio text. And what is really important is that whether these behaviors can actually affect test performance scores. But importantly, these types of research are primarily based on retrospective verbal reports. But what are the potential issues when we come to understanding cognitive processes involved in listening? Is that they are subjected to potentially instructional cue bias from interviewers, and as well as it is also limited by the verbal skills and recall abilities of your interviewees. So one way to actually go about
sorry, Stacey, can I just say a word here? I don't know if it's the quality of your microphone or something, because the voice gets choppy a little bit, and it seems like.
Okay, can you hear me better?
Can you keep it closer to your mouth? Maybe that will be much better. Yeah.
Okay.
Sorry, go ahead.
That's all right. Okay, so one way, so perhaps we can actually overcome these issues by using eye tracking. The reason is because the eyes are essentially the windows to our minds. And keeping that in mind, what we're really interested is whether native and non-native English speakers differ in their performances during the WLP test, and whether their first language can influence the way they gaze test items in the WLP test across the different stages, and more importantly, whether these gaze behaviors can play a role in predicting the listening test scores. So we've recruited about 100 participants from Nanyang Technological University. The majority of them are native English speakers. So the test that we use is a Canadian academic English language computer edition. We focused on using an authentic stimuli from Paragon testing. So there are two sections that we are using, different types of, which focuses on different types of topics, economics and world history. So the majority of the questions are primarily MCQ questions, and they're spread across 5 pages. So participants come into the lab for one session. So the eye tracker that we are using is a 300 Hz Tobii eye tracker. So we started off by calibrating the eye tracker to establish their gaze positions in relation to the screen. And subsequently, it took 2 sections of the test. Firstly, the economics lecture. The first, they have to go through 3 stages of listening. The first being pre-listening stage, where they have 2.5 minutes reading the questions, followed by the while listening stage, where they get to answer the test questions while listening to the audio text, and as well as the post-listening stage, where they are involved in just checking of answers and finishing up the rest of the questions that were unanswered in the while listening stage. And after this first section, they've gone on to the second section. So after collecting the data, we perform an inspection check, ensuring that at least 80% of the gaze are present, and we remove any trials that we can't actually perform a calibration, that we have poor calibration on. So we left with about 66 participants, with the majority still being native English speakers. So we've tabulated the test scores, annotated the scenes that they viewed, and we've established the areas of interest that we're interested in, which is the test items, so which is highlighted in the blue area. So typically, this is what an eye movement looks like. The gaze behaviors will look like, sorry. So eye movements, there are 2 types of eye movements. When we are facing static images, we have things like saccades and fixations. Saccades are simply faster eye movements, whereas fixations are slower eye movements. So essentially what we're interested in is dwell, which is a visit into the test items, which is essentially the lines and the dots. So the lines represent your saccades, and the dots are simply fixations, which are temporal pauses in eye movements that allow you to uptake visual information that you see. So what after a series of in-depth processing, we've actually obtained durational data, both total and average dwell and fixation duration data, and as well as count data. But because these stages of listening are of different lengths, in order to compare them, we've actually normalized them, which is to express them as in relation to their duration of time by dividing the absolute data against the time, to express them in percentages for durational data, and as well as visits and fixations per minute for count data. So what did we find? So the listening test, the combined of 2 sections, has acceptable reliability with Chromebox alpha at 0.62. So in terms of test scores, not surprisingly, our EL1 candidates perform much better than our EL2 candidates. In terms of gaze behaviors, as you can see, there is no difference between EL1 participants and EL2 candidates. This essentially means that participants, both groups of participants focus about 65% of the time on the test items and 35% on the rest of the screen. Now, what about fixation? So what we have actually found is that EL2 participants fixate, has a higher proportion of time fixating on the test items in total, which is about 2% higher than that of EL1 participants. So as you can see,
just to interpret what that means, especially for the audience who are not familiar with the terminology, that means that they kept gazing or looking at the test items for a longer period of time than those people who had English as their first language. That's what it means.
Okay, so in terms of average visit duration and average fixation duration, as you can see from the graph, there is interaction effect. So what we can see is that for both the pre-listening and while listening stages, you'll find that EL1 participants have spend a lower proportion of time for every visit and every fixation on the test items. For visit duration, however, for the last stage in the post-listening stage, we found that EL1 participants are not different from EL2 participants. Whereas in terms of the stages of listening, the while listening stage is always less than that of both the pre and while listening stages, whereas the pre will always be less than that of the post-listening stage. The only difference that you will see for average fixation duration is that in the post-listening stage, our native English speakers spend a higher proportion of average fixation duration, greater average fixation duration than EL2 participants. Now, in terms of visit frequency, as you can see from the graph, our EL1 participants, there is in fact a group and a stages of listening, the main effects of stages of listening and group. So what we can see from the graph is that across the stages of listening, EL1 participants visit the test items more frequently than EL2 participants. Whereas in the while listening stage, they actually visit the test items more frequently than that of pre and post listening stage. And likewise for pre-listening stage, all participants visit the test items more frequently than that in the post-listening stage.
Nice. So we have around 2 minutes.
Okay, so I'll skip that. Okay, so for what we found out is that EL2 participants, the normalized average visit duration predict the test scores for EL2 participants with the gaze behaviors contributing about 19% of the variation in the test scores. Like as I said, the differences are not unexpected, and it could actually reflect that of the difficulties that they have for L2 participants, such as inability to listen from an L2 perspective. So in terms of test scores, in terms of using standardized test scores, so EL2 candidates will be at a disadvantage if no further information are being used. So what we found out is that they have very distinctive group behaviors that may be due to language command, and as well as perhaps cultural issues. But more importantly, is that you actually see that they have similarity in terms of the gaze behaviors across the stages of listening, which suggests that the test items actually specifies the type of information that you would use to process the questions. So what we found is that there is higher normalized average fixation duration on the test items, and it suggests that the better they perform during the test. It brings about the question of constructive relevance variance, whereby it is not actually testing listening per se, but in fact testing reading. And it actually questions the cognitive validity of the test. What I want to highlight is that this is in fact the first study to show that reading or gaze behaviors can actually influence the way their test scores for EL2 participants.
Yeah, thank you very much, Stacy. Well done. It's just 15 minutes. Awesome. Yeah, that's my watch, which is ringing. So thank you. This brings us to the end of the first presentation. I've already seen one question in the chat box. It's a wonderful question. I have taken notes of that, and we will get back to that question at the end of all the presentations. Please, I encourage you to write your questions in the chat box. Anything is really welcome. Now, I would like to move on to the second presentation of today, and that's going to be by Franz Holzknecht. So I'm going to provide a very brief introduction to Franz's work. Franz holds a PhD in language testing from Lancaster University, an MA in language testing from Lancaster University, and an MA in teaching English and sports from the University of Innsbruck. He currently works as a postdoctoral researcher for the language testing research group at the University of Innsbruck. Before that, Franz was professionally involved in language test development for the standardized Austrian school living exam. His research interests are mainly in language assessment, particularly in L2 listening and writing assessment. Franz has published his work in the journals Language Testing, Assessing Writing, papers in Language Testing and Assessment, and in several book chapters. So let me just read out his topic: using eye tracking in research on audio-only listening tests. Thank you very much. Over to you, Franz. What time is it there, by the way?
Thanks, Wahid. Can you hear me?
Yeah. Loud and clear.
It's 2:30 here in Austria at the moment.
Wonderful.
So more civilized time than in Singapore.
It's fine. It's great here. Yeah. So over to you, Franz.
Thanks. So I'll try and share my screen. Can you see my presentation?
Yes, it's there. We can see it. Yes.
Great. So in my talk today, I will outline 2 studies, and in doing so, I will highlight the benefits of using eye tracking in listening studies. But I'd also like to highlight what gaze data I think cannot tell us, particularly in study 2. And I will finish my talk with some implications. So the first study was on response order effects in multiple choice listening items, and it was actually published earlier this year in language testing. And the study was based on an earlier investigation in which we were interested in the cognitive validity of the aptis listening test. And that is the old version of the aptis listening test, which consisted of 25 4-option multiple choice items. And in that original study, we actually did not focus on response order. But we used the data from the original study for the newer study, which was published this year. So in the original study, about 30 participants took 25 items of the aptis listening test on a Tobii TX300 eye tracker. And we actually used eye tracking to stimulate verbal recalls in order to tap into test takers' cognitive processes. So this is what a typical item looked like. It had a question, a stem, and 4 answer options to choose from. And during data collection of the original study, but also after the study was published, when we looked at the eye tracking data, we noticed a recurring pattern in that participants would tend to focus longer on the first item than on the other items. And we therefore set up this second study, which was published earlier this year, in which we then took the eye tracking data alone and modeled the eye tracking data in a linear mixed effects regression model, where we were actually interested in the response order and whether this pattern, which we noticed, was actually statistically significant. We also had to control for a number of variables in our model in order not to confound our findings. And when we ran the model, we actually indeed found this effect, and it was very clear and also statistically significant in that participants would focus much longer on the first answer option than on any of the other options, particularly the last option, which received 75% less attention. So based on this finding, then, we formed the hypothesis that this may actually impact item difficulty, because we hypothesized that items where the correct response was in the last position may actually be more difficult than items where the correct response was in the first position, because it received considerably less attention. So we received some data from the British Council on 200 live aptis listening items across all CFR levels covered in the exam. And each item was taken by about 6,000 test takers. And we also received the item difficulty measures for each of these items. And we again modeled this data in a linear regression model, where we were interested in the correct response position and whether this actually really had an impact on item difficulty. And we, of course, controlled for the CEFR level of the items. And when we ran this model, we again found a statistically significant effect. It wasn't as clear as the gaze data, but there was an effect in that participants would indeed struggle more with items where the correct response was in the last position. Those items were on average 0.5 logits more difficult than items where the correct response was in the first position. And we did not find statistical significance for the second and third position. But overall, our findings showed that response ordering listening items with 4 options does actually seem to impact item difficulty. So what were the benefits of using eye tracking in this study? Well, first and foremost, eye tracking allowed us to see the overall viewing patterns of the participants. Although we used eye tracking only as a stimulus for the verbal recalls in the original study, had we not used it, we would never have noticed these viewing patterns because none of our other data actually would have showed this. And because we saw these viewing patterns, we statistically analyzed them, and then we formed this hypothesis about item difficulty, and were able to show that there was this effect. But had we not used eye tracking in the first place, we would never have been able to detect this effect. So moving on now to the second study, which I conducted as part of my PhD at Lancaster University, in which I focused on the issue of single play and double play in listening tasks. I wanted to investigate this because it's still quite a contentious issue in the language testing world. There's quite a bit of inconsistency among testing boards with regards to that issue. So there are some testing boards which play all of the listening texts twice, such as Cambridge, others which play all of the listening texts only once, such as IELTS or TOEFL. There are also intermediary solutions, such as giving students the choice to play the listening text a second time, which Aptis does, I believe, and others using a mixture between single play and double play, such as Trinity. So I wanted to investigate this also because the majority of previous studies that had looked at this only focused on test scores and found that double play, so playing the listening text a second time, makes listening tests slightly easier. But I was really interested in whether this convention of playing the listening text a second time actually had any effect on the way test takers listen, so any effect on the coverage of the listening construct. And in one part of my PhD, I also used eye tracking to stimulate recalls to tap into test takers' response processes, as I've outlined before. And in this part of the study, I recruited 16 participants who completed 4 tasks from 4 listening tasks. They are while listening performance tasks from the Austrian Matura exam. And they completed them in counterbalance design in single play and double play, again on a Tobii TX300 eye tracker. And for those of you who are not familiar with this methodology, I'd like to briefly illustrate it to you. So the participants completed the tasks as they would in a normal exam situation. So they did the whole task, and only after they had finished the task, I showed them a video of their eye movements while they had been working on the task, in order to help them remember what they were thinking while they were working on the task. And on the screen here, the red dots, you can see those are the participants' eye movements, and I would just briefly play this video to you. So this methodology worked really well in that it basically took students back in time to when they were doing the task, and it really helped them remember their thought processes. So as a side, I'd also like to briefly tell you about my overall findings of the PhD, although it's not related to the talk today. So overall, my verbal recall study confirmed another investigation which I conducted on a larger number of participants, and both studies agreed in showing that double play actually leads to a better construct representation and less construct irrelevance. But that's just a side. I'd like to move on now to the topic of the talk today, which is eye tracking. So what were the benefits of using eye tracking in this study? Well, first of all, it allowed participants to complete the test as they would in a normal exam situation. in many listening studies which use verbal recalls or retrospective recalls, the listening tasks are actually interrupted after 1 or 2 items, and test takers are then asked what they were thinking during those 2 items, and the rationale behind this being to avoid introducing memory effects into the data. But by using eye tracking or eye gaze stimuli, this really allowed participants to do the task as a whole. And because it was such a powerful stimulus, it really helped them remember very well what they were thinking during the task, during task completion, and it led to very rich verbal recall data. I also asked participants how they felt about seeing their eye movements, and all of them actually thought it helped them remembering their thought processes. I'd just like to illustrate this by one quote from participant 1, who said, "It was very useful. When I looked at a word for some time, then it was like, sure, here I was thinking this, I remember again. Only seeing my answers again would not have helped me nearly as much." And actually all participants said something similar. So this worked really well. I would also like to highlight, though, in this talk today, what I believe gaze data can not really tell us when we use it for listening studies. So the basic underlying assumption of most eye tracking research in reading, for example, is the eye-mind hypothesis. So that it proposed by, I believe, Justin Carpenter in 1980. So that is that the point of gaze actually indicates what a participant is paying attention to at that particular moment. But I would argue that for listening studies, we cannot actually always hold this eye-mind hypothesis to be true. So I believe that eye traces are not always an indication of what participants are paying attention to. And I will illustrate this with a number of quotes in a minute. And so therefore, I think we cannot directly infer response processes in listening tasks by only looking at eye tracking data in isolation. And I think researchers should be careful when they interpret eye tracking data, which is based on listening tasks. And in order to illustrate this, I would like to show you a number of quotations from my stimulated recalls. So the first quotation I will show you is from participant 2, and the quotation actually stems from a point in the recording when they were thinking about question number 4. So they had already answered the first 3 questions in the task, and the sound file at that point was dealing with question number 4, but they were actually looking back up to question number 1. So I stopped the recording and asked them, so why did you look back up to question number 1 again here? And participant 2 then said, so I always do that, also in school. For example, if I don't have an answer to a question 4 in this case, I look at something completely different in the hope that the answer strikes me. Then I look at my desk or at the blackboard or something. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. So this really illustrates that although the participant was looking at question number 1 and the gaze data indicated that they were looking at that question, they were actually thinking about or paying attention to question number 4. Similarly here, participant 11 telling me, here I simply stared at the middle of the screen and concentrated because I knew I answered these questions correctly. However, the middle of the screen actually happened to be an answer option to one of the questions. So had I only looked at the eye tracking data in isolation, I would have wrongly inferred that the participant at this point focused really hard on this answer option, when in fact they were just trying to concentrate on the listening or on the recording. Similarly, participant 1 saying, I thought it was cool how he was talking about that. So I focused more on the listening text and less on the questions. And a final quotation, there would be many more. Unfortunately, I don't have time to share them all with you. But a final one I'd like to show you was from participant 5, who was saying, I was actually listening pretty closely. So actually concentrating more on what he says and not what he says here in the questions. And I think that's why I overlooked this, because I was listening rather than reading. And I think this is really the crucial point when we look at eye tracking data based on listening tasks. We simply cannot disentangle participants' reading processes from their listening processes, from their test taking processes, by only looking at the eye tracking data. So what are the implications of this? I think overall, eye tracking can be a very useful tool for researching audio-only listening tests. And I hope I was able to show today that it can reveal the overall viewing patterns of participants, as also Stacey and Vahid showed in their study, which in turn can lead to new research questions, which otherwise may have not been investigated, or even researchers may not even have thought about investigating these questions without looking at the viewing patterns. And I also tried to show that eye tracking can serve as a very powerful stimulus for verbal recalls in order to tap into test takers' response processes. But I would also like to highlight that eye tracking data alone cannot really tell us about the detailed cognitive processes of test takers while they complete listening tests, simply because we cannot be sure whether they really are reading or taking in what they are looking at, or whether they are listening or thinking about something else. So in order to tap into these cognitive processes, I think we need to combine eye tracking data with other process tracing methods, such as stimulated recall, as has also been highlighted before by other researchers. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Franz. That was a wonderful presentation. I enjoyed it, especially because I also like to investigate listening comprehension and its assessment. It was really great. You have had maybe 2 or 3 questions so far. So I have saved all of these questions. I'll get back to you at the end of the presentations. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you. Okay, everybody. Thank you very much for staying with us. Now it's time for our third presentation. In this presentation, Xiaoliu and Guoxing Yu are going to discuss the application of eye tracking. So I'm going to provide a brief background about both of the presenters. Xiaoliu is a PhD candidate in educational assessment and is being supervised by Professor Guoxing Yu, her co-presenter in this study at the University of Bristol. Her research interests include computer-assisted language learning and assessment and its application in English as a second or foreign language context. Her doctoral research pilots the use of eye tracking to explore Chinese EFL learners' engagement and feedback provided by automated writing evaluation systems. So our second presenter is Professor Guoxing Yu, who's a professor of language assessment, University of Bristol, and an expert member of European Association of Language Testing and Assessment. Guoxing earned his PhD in 2005 from the University of Bristol. His dissertation was awarded Jacqueline A. Ross TOEFL Dissertation Award by Educational Testing Service. Guoxing has published his work in a number of journals, including Language Testing, Language Assessment Quarterly, Assessing Writing, Language Testing in Asia. And thanks to prolific background of Guoxing, I cannot go through all the publications that he has made. So today's topic that is going to be presented by Xiaoliu and Guoxing is exploring L2 learners' online processing of automated written corrective feedback, which is an eye tracking study. I would like to pass the time to the 2 presenters. Thank you very much.
Oh, sorry, just 1 second. Can you hear me well?
Sure, yes. Yeah.
And can you see the slides now?
Oh yeah, they're all clear. Yes.
Thank you.
Please.
Hi, everyone. So today I will be presenting on behalf of my co-author and my supervisor, Guoxing, and he will chime in if necessary. Our presentation today comprises 3 main sections, including research background, the present research, and potential implications. Automated written corrective feedback, AWCF for short, refers to the feedback provided by specialized computer software on students' written products. In the previous literature, AWCF, AWE feedback, as well as automated feedback have been used interchangeably. And today we will be using the short form AWCF throughout the whole presentation. The past decade has seen the rapid development of AWCF. First, there has been an increase of AWE systems that can provide AWCF on students' writing. For example, in the year of 2019, 80 line systems have been identified. Second, the design of AWCF has been gradually aligned with second language acquisition research and writing research to better accommodate learners' feedback needs. Such alignment include the feedback, providing the feedback at different levels of granularity, as well as multiple teaching and writing aids. In the following slides, we will introduce a new system to showcase what AWCF looks like at the current stage. Cambridge English Write and Improve is a free online English learning platform designed by Cambridge Assessment English. The design of this system is informed by second language acquisition research, especially in terms of interaction theory, and it aims to promote L2 learners' self-monitoring and revising skills. In terms of the feedback, at the discourse level, Write and Improve provides a holistic score together with a brief comment for students to understand their overall writing performance. And in addition, a personal progress graph will also be presented for the students to see their score changes, or in other words, their writing progress across different drafts. I'm sorry. At the sentence level, as we can see here, Write and Improve provides indirect feedback on the quality of each sentence through color shading, when the dark yellow color background indicates major problems in the sentence. At the word level, Write and Improve provides both indirect feedback where only error explanation is provided, as well as direct feedback where both error explanation and error correction are provided. In addition to AWCF, Write and Improve also provides writing aids for students to keep a track of their revision history. Teachers, on the other hand, can make use of the teaching aids to monitor their students' interaction with AWCF throughout the whole process. Those recent developments appear really promising because they hold great potential to meet L2 learners' increasing needs for online writing support, especially in this global pandemic, as well as post-pandemic educational settings. However, whether students or L2 learners can actually benefit from such recent developments still remains unknown. Based on our critical review of the AWCF research in the past 20 years, we have found that previous studies mainly focused on the impact of using AWCF on students' writing improvement. Those studies have yielded inconclusive findings. In addition, there's a lack of research on L2 learner processing of AWCF, and so far we have only found 3 studies. Those 3 studies have shedded important initial light into our understanding of how L2 learners engage with AWCF. However, because of this really small sample size, the heavy reliance on interview as a data collection method, as well as the descriptive nature of data, our understanding of how L2 learners process AWCF still remains limited, which prevented the researchers from establishing a link between the provision of AWCF and learning outcomes. As such, more and more researchers have been calling for further research on the L2 learning process of AWCF. As a direct response to the increasing costs, our study aims to deeply explore how L2 learners process AWCF in the process of essay revision. In addition, we also set out to investigate whether and how L2 learners can benefit from recent developments of AWCF and the underlying factors. However, given the limited time of today's presentation, we will only present and address 3 research questions that are related to the cognitive process. Our first question is, how much attention do Chinese EFL learners pay to different types of AWCF by write and improve? Research question number 2, how much cognitive effort do Chinese EFL learners expend when using AWCF by write and improve to correct their errors? And question number 3, how does the type of feedback affect Chinese EFL learners' attention to and cognitive effort expenditure in processing AWCF by write and improve? Our participants included 24 Chinese EFL learners at a major university in Sichuan province, China. The instruments we used for data collection included a Tobii X260 eye tracker, as well as 2 pre-loaded graph-based writing tasks, also known as IELTS Academic Task 1. The data we collected included participants' eye movements when viewing and responding to each instance of AWCF. We also collected participants' detailed reflection on their feedback viewing and essay revision behavior with reference to their eye movements. In total, we collected 48 sets of eye gaze plot recordings with corresponding stimulated recall interview responses. And by the way, the stimulated recall interview was conducted right after the eye tracking session. As for data analysis, we manually annotated all eye gaze plots recordings through invaluable based on a coding scheme created by the researcher. The reason why we need to create our own coding scheme is that previous coding scheme just didn't exist for this kind of analysis. And I will show you the sample coding scheme in a minute. Based on the coding, we then operationalize learners' attention as the total fixation duration. In other words, how much time the participant has fixated on each type of feedback. As for the stimulated recall interview response, again, we conducted the annotation based on a semantic analysis using a hybrid approach of both inductive and deductive coding, and again, through invaluable. Based on the coding, students' cognitive effort in expenditure was operationalized their self-reported efforts to formulate and test the underlying grammatical rule of each feedback. To ensure the coding quality, 30% of the data were double-coded with really high coding reliability, as shown here. And here I would like to show you the data, the eye gaze plot recordings we used for this study. As we just saw in the video clip, the participant started reading the feedback on the use of on and off, and then she switched to the era of revision to make revisions, and then switch back for the feedback to make sure that she made the right corrections. And here is a sample coding scheme, and based on the coding scheme, we actually coded students' eye gaze plot recordings as well as stimulated recall responses. So what did we find? In terms of participants' attention to AWCF by write and improve, as shown by this specific column here, we found that all of them seem to spend much more time on indirect than direct AWCF by write and improve. And if you still remember here, by indirect feedback, we refer to the indirect sentence level feedback and indirect word level feedback. As for participants' cognitive effort expenditure in processing AWCF, as shown in this specific column here, we also found that participants seem to expend more cognitive effort in processing indirect than direct AWCF by write input. In order to test the pattern, we conducted further Wilcoxon sign rank tests to test our hypothesis about the impact of the type of feedback on participants' attention to and cognitive effort expenditure in processing AWCF. The results showed that the type of feedback, in other words, the explicitness of feedback, had significant impact on the amount of attention participants paid to feedback with nudge effects, and as shown here. And the type of feedback also had significant impact on participants' cognitive effort expenditure in processing such feedback, again with median to nudge effect size. Based on this finding, it could be safe to argue that type of feedback or explicitness of feedback may be a determining factor in learners' success at revising such errors. And the interview response by one particular participant, Alice, who made 11 attempts to correct one highlighted sentence, may tell us more information about this. And I will give you a few seconds to read through the response here. And I will move on now. As we can find here in the interview response, the biggest difficulty for the participants could be that they couldn't figure out what was wrong in the highlighted sentences. Therefore, they had to make multiple revisions in order to test their hypothesis about the underlying grammatical rule. Sometimes this kind of hypothesis formulation and testing process could be so overwhelming that they even started asking the first researcher, that's me, for help. Based on the findings of our study, we would like to make a few implications. First, in terms of the further development of AWCF, we would argue that AWCF needs to be developmentally appropriate for all L2 learners. By that, we mean, first, we need to focus on the simplicity and clarity of feedback. For example, we can increase the direct feedback while scaffolding indirect feedback. Second, we will need to prioritize in order not to overwhelm the L2 learners. We will need to prioritize salient errors and allow learners to switch on and off certain kind of feedback on errors at different stages of revision. For example, for Chinese EF learners, it may be a good idea for us to focus on the most salient errors such as word choice, article, and preposition, etc. in the initial drafts. Third, it would be great if we can allow the interactions in the feedback loop. For example, we can encourage learners and teacher to interact with each other for timely follow-up advices on the difficult revisions. Second, in terms of the use of AWCF, the take-home message could be that please don't leave the students to deal with AWCF on their own. As a teacher, it is highly recommended that teachers should use this kind of technology in a blended learning environment. In other words, we need to combine face-to-face instruction or online meetings together with students' use of AWCF. By doing that, teachers may be able to track students' use of the feedback and then identify students' difficulties in processing specific type of feedback. For example, as we have talked about earlier, Alice was not able to figure out her use of comma splice. And then as the teacher can provide timely follow-up guidance on how to deal with such kind of errors in the student's writing. Finally, as one of the earliest studies to employ eye tracking in AWE-mediated writing research, we would like to reflect on our experiences of using eye tracking as a process tracing method. It has been agreed upon that eye tracking will enable the researcher to collect rich, in-depth data of the learning process without interfering the cognitive processes. And this study has proved that. And however, there might be the potential challenge for writing researchers in particular, that because of the dynamic nature of writing data, researchers may not be able to predefining areas of interest. Therefore, they will not be able to automatically extract eye tracking indices such as fixation saccades, as the other researchers did in the earlier two presentations. That means there will be the need to manually annotate the data. Well, in this study, we found that the manual annotation of eye tracking data, especially in conjunction with stimulated recall responses, turn out to be, sorry?
Sorry, Shah, I have to interrupt. Sorry, I was wondering if you could wrap it up because we're running out of time here.
Yeah, this is the last slide. Thank you.
Yeah, excellent. Go ahead. Okay.
Yeah, so we just want to emphasize that the manual annotation with the stimulated recall responses could be a robust approach for a time-sensitive and fine-grained representation of learner's process of AWCF. However, we also need to point out that this process could be really time-consuming and painstaking. So researchers in the future may want to take this into consideration. And finally, we just would like to thank for the financial support by ETS and British Council, as well as the full access to Write and Improve by Cambridge Assessment English. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It was a wonderful presentation, especially the fact that it was on writing. And from what I understand, there are not many studies on writing where eye tracking is used. Great. Okay, so our final presentation for tonight is by Ruslan, and I'd like to say a few words about Ruslan Suvarov. He's an assistant professor in applied linguistics at the University of Western Ontario, Canada, where he teaches courses in second language assessment and computer-assisted language learning, or CAL for short. His research interests lie at the intersection of language testing and assessment, computer-assisted language learning, and instructional technology and design, with a particular focus on the application of eye tracking technology in language assessment contexts. Ruslan has given numerous presentations and workshops at various regional, national, and international conferences, and published in Language Testing, Calico Journal, Canadian Journal of Applied Linguistics, TESOL, EJ, or Electronic Journal, as well as edited volumes, conference proceedings, and encyclopedias and research reports. He's a co-author of Blended Language Program Evaluation, published by Palgrave Macmillan in 2016. His topic for tonight is investigating test-wiseness strategies via eye tracking. Over to you, Ruslan. Thank you.
Thank you, Vahid. Let me share my slides. I hope you can see them.
Yes, I can see them. Yes.
Okay, perfect. Thank you for the introduction again. So today I'm going to talk about investigating test-wiseness strategies via eye tracking. So if we look at the existing validation research, traditionally it has focused on the analysis of the assessment outcomes. It's called product-oriented validation research. But recently there has been a call for process-oriented validation research that actually looks at the test-taking strategies and processes that underlie the test takers' responses. And in fact, the Standards for Educational and Psychological Testing list response processes as one of the five sources of validity evidence. So we need to look not only at the scores, but also at the processes that the test takers go through before they arrive to those scores. So since the topic of my presentation is test-taking strategies, I thought I would give just a very brief overview of what this entails. There are two types of test-taking strategies, according to Andrew Cohen. These are test management strategies and test-wiseness strategies. So the test management strategies are the cognitive and linguistic processes that are relevant to the construct used by the test takers to answer items meaningfully and responsibly. So these are the strategies that we do want the test takers to use. And the test-wiseness strategies can be defined as strategies that entail the use of knowledge of testing formats and other peripheral information to obtain responses, very possibly the correct ones, on language tests without engaging the requisite L2 knowledge and performance ability. So a good example of a test-wiseness strategy would be guessing. Research on test-taking strategies has traditionally been done using concurrent and retrospective verbal reports and surveys, but the issue with this methodology is that it is prone to reactivity and veridicality risks. That is, the test takers oftentimes, or participants oftentimes, what they report they were doing or thinking during a specific task does not necessarily correspond to what they actually did. So one solution, and Dr. Holzknecht has already very nicely demonstrated that, is to combine these verbal report methods with eye tracking, and specifically use eye gaze, eye movement data, eye movements as a stimulus for verbal reports. So the motivation for the study that I'm presenting today stems from my previous research in which I investigated the test-taking strategies used for in the Michigan English test. And what I found was that the use of test-wiseness strategies when answering items on the Michigan English test appear to have a significant impact on the participants' test scores. And specifically, the multiple choice format seemed conducive to the selection of answers by guessing and eliminating other options, especially for lower level test takers. So the goal of this study that I'm reporting today was to find out if a different item format would be less conducive to the use of these test-wiseness strategies that we don't want our test takers to use. So the two item types that I used in this study were multiple choice items and multiple true-false items. Everyone is familiar with a multiple choice item. Here is an example. It's a 4-option multiple choice item. A multiple true-false item, unlike a multiple choice item, does not show all the options at the same time. It shows one option at a time and basically turns it into a true-false question. And a test taker has to decide whether this option is correct or not. So if a test taker chooses no for option A, then the computer will show the next option, option B. And if a test taker chooses yes for option B, then option C and D will not be shown. But the next, instead, the test taker will be taken to the next item. So the 3 research questions that I will try to cover today were the following. The first research question was, to what extent do the test takers perform differently when completing multiple choice versus multiple true-false items? The second question was, to what extent does the use of test-wiseness strategies differ for the 2 item types? And the third question was, to what extent does the use of test-wiseness strategies affect observed scores on these 2 item types? So I had 40 participants in this study. They were enrolled in an advanced level ESL courses. They varied in range and had different L1 backgrounds and number of years that they spent studying English. I used a video-based academic listening test that I developed earlier that had 6 video lectures, short lectures, about 2-3 minutes each of which was followed by 5 questions. So there were a total of 30 questions on this test. So these 30 questions or 30 items were in 2 formats. So half of them were in a multiple choice format, another half was in a multiple true-false format. And I had 2 versions of the test for counterbalance design. So in version 1, the first lecture was followed by 5 multiple choice questions. In version 2, the first lecture was followed by 5 multiple true-false questions, and so on. I used GazePoint GP3 HD remote eye tracker with a data sampling rate of 150 Hertz. I also used cued retrospective reporting, which is basically stimulated recalls that are cued by the eye movements. And I also had a background questionnaire to collect information about the participants. So this is a screenshot of the video prompt, a short lecture that was followed either by a multiple choice question in one version of the test or by a multiple true-false question. And again, each mini lecture was followed by 5 items. So the data collection procedure consisted of 3 phases. So I had individual 2-hour data collection sessions with each participant. So during this session, there was a setup phase, the first 10-15 minutes when each participant received the instructions, was asked to complete a background questionnaire and underwent eye calibration. Then the test phase that in general, on average, lasted for about 45-50 minutes, where the test takers had to complete the test with their eye movements being recorded. And then after each lecture and 5 items, I paused the test and did the cued retrospective reports, which was the post-test phase that lasted for about 50 to 60 minutes. So I collected 3 types of data: test score data, eye tracking data, and verbal data. To answer the first question, research question, which asked about the difference in performance on multiple choice and multiple true-false items, I calculated descriptive statistics and paired samples t-test for the test score data. To answer the second research question, which asked about the difference in the use of test-wiseness strategies for answering these 2 item types, I looked at the verbal data and eye tracking data, and specifically I tallied the number of test items that were answered correctly and incorrectly using test-wiseness strategies. And I also did a scan path analysis of the eye movement data to triangulate that with the students' verbal responses. And to answer the third research question, which asked about the effect of test-wiseness strategies on observed scores on multiple choice and multiple true-false items, I did descriptive statistics for the observed and adjusted test scores and Wilcoxon signed rank test to compare them. So before I go into the results, I would like to briefly talk about the criteria that I used to identify test-wiseness strategies. So I specifically focused only on guessing and elimination, and I ignored other test-wiseness strategies. So for example, if a test taker clicked on the wrong option by mistake, I did not count that as a test-wiseness strategy. I also differentiated between uninformed and informed guesses in the data. So informed guesses would be educated guesses, so guesses that are triggered by keywords or the notes that the participants took, whereas uninformed guesses were pure random guesses. And those were the guesses that I focused on when identifying test-wiseness strategies. Same goes for elimination, informed versus uninformed. I focused on uninformed elimination. So overall, I was very conservative in the way I identified guessing and elimination. So basically, if the participants did not show any indication of knowing the answer or using keywords, notes, visuals from the prompt, and they had a low confidence level in whether whether the selected answer was correct, then I counted those as test-wiseness strategies. If there was any indication that they did hear something in the lecture that helped them choose a specific option, then I did not count that as a test-wiseness strategy. So to answer the first research question, which was about the extent to which L2 learners perform differently on these 2 item types, these are the results of the descriptive statistics. So as you can see, for multiple choice items, the mean was 10.13. For multiple true-false, it was lower, 8.35. And the reliability of this test was 0.71. And the results of the paired samples t-test show that this difference was statistically significant with a large effect size, 0.79. To answer the second research question, which was about the extent, which asked to what extent does the use of test-wiseness strategies differ for these 2 item types, I calculated, so in the blue column you see answered correctly. So I had 40 participants, each participant took 30 items. So overall I had 1,200 item scores. So out of those 1200 item scores, I found that 108 items, or about 9% of all the items, were answered using test-wiseness strategies, that is, uninformed guessing and elimination. Out of those 108 items, 42 items were answered correctly and 66 items were answered incorrectly. And out of the items that were answered correctly, 25 were multiple choice items and 17 were multiple true-false items. The third question asked about the extent to which the use of test-wiseness strategies affected observed scores on these two item types. So an observed score is the score that the participants actually got, whereas the adjusted score was calculated by deducting the number of items that were answered correctly using test-wiseness strategies from the observed scores. And the Wilcoxon-Sign rank test indicated that the observed scores were statistically significantly higher than the adjusted scores for both item types. In other words, if we take into account the participants' use of test-wiseness strategies, their actual, these adjusted scores are lower than their observed scores. So I'll briefly summarize the findings. What I found was that the multiple true-false items were more difficult than multiple choice items. Test-wiseness strategies were used less frequently for answering multiple true-false items compared to multiple choice items. And the use of test-wiseness strategies had a statistically significant effect on the observed scores. So what these findings, the way we can interpret them is that the multiple true-false items appear to be less conducive to the introduction of constructive relevant variance because, first of all, the test takers cannot use the elimination strategy on these items, and that there is a lower chance of guessing the correct answer because the test takers have to consider each option individually as opposed to trying to compare and contrast. Overall, I would say that the multiple choice items forced the test takers to think which of these four options is the best answer, whereas multiple true-false items forced them to think about, is this the correct answer? I think the findings have implications for validation research, item design, and social justice. So they highlight the importance of gathering validity evidence based on response processes. In terms of the items design, if we use multiple true-false, it's important to create distractors that avoid ambiguity and require one specific answer. In terms of limitations, the item previewing was not allowed, so it was a post-listening test. There was a order effect in multiple true-false items, and the interviews were done in English rather than participants L1, which can also be considered as a limitation. And one last thing I will say is that if we think about future directions in this line of research, it would be nice to compare the use of test-wiseness strategies and their effect on the observed scores across different proficiency levels. In my study, it was only advanced level learners. Another suggestion would be to compare the effect of test-wiseness strategies on different question types, as well as investigate the types of questions for which multiple true-false would be a better format than multiple choice. So for example, multiple true-false may work better for questions that do not contain any ambiguity. I would like to acknowledge the financial support from Language Learning that provided money for this study, and thank you.
Thank you very much, Russ. It was just 15 minutes. Well done.
Okay.
I enjoyed listening to you. It was a great study. So we have come to the end of the presentations, everybody. Thank you very much for staying with us. I hope my microphone is not acting up. It sometimes does.
Oh, it's perfect now, Vahid. Thanks.
It's fine now? Good, good.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, because Chris earlier told me that the microphone seems to be acting up. Anyway, sorry about that. It sometimes happens. So I have collected quite a number of wonderful questions for all of the presenters. And I see that some like Shah and Franz have already started to answer some of the questions that actually Franz answered almost all the questions in a file that he shared with us. But I would like to take this opportunity to ask some of the questions and also request the presenters to open their microphones and their video so the audience will be able to both see and hear them, and ask perhaps one or two questions that I have selected from a range of the questions that have been posed there. So can I just go in a chronological order and ask the first question from Stacy? Stacy, this is actually a question for you and me, but I'd like to pass it to you. It's a difficult one, so I'm not going to take it. It's by Monique, and she's asking, was the area of interest of the item treated as one area of interest? In other words, is this what the 65% gaze at the item represents, or was the item divided into different areas of interest depending on which keywords you were targeting? And I suppose the answer is the first one, isn't it? The first scenario.
So for every, so we have a total of 22 test items. So each test item is treated as one area of interest. There's a reason why we didn't actually split up or specifically focus on one specific keyword, because we have a range of different questions across the different tests. Majority of them are MCQs, but we also have like fill in the blanks. So that's why we sort of focus on generically on test items as opposed to specific keywords. If you were to rely more on keywords, or if you want to do things like stamps or as well as your leaves, so you need to actually have quite a big space in between those stamps and leaves. But for us, those little spaces in between those questions are very small, so we can actually only include it as one single AOI. Does that answer your question? Yep.
Yes, thank you, Stacy.
Okay, thank you, great. Yes, I'm gonna move to the second question now. Linda has asked friends. I think this is an interesting question because, well, let me see, at least two of the studies included think-aloud, or let's say qualitative stimulated recall protocols. So the question is, how long after recording the eye tracking data did you conduct the stimulated recall interviews?
Yeah, so the participants did the stimulated recalls immediately after they completed the task. So a task was about 3 minutes long, and then once the task was finished, they completed the stimulated recall. So this was the same for single play and double play. In double play, of course, the time was longer because they had to listen in text twice, but it was immediately after they had completed a task.
Okay, so it's possible to combine eye tracking and think-aloud protocols quite usefully. That's another question that has been asked, actually.
Yeah, I think so. I think it works really well because it sort of triangulates the data and backs up your findings, maybe,
okay.
of your eye tracking data.
Okay, nice. And since you're here, and friends, you know, you have received quite a lot of questions, and thank you for you to creating that document. Another question I would like to ask here is from Santi. I just read it out to you. If gaze data cannot always tell us about what one is paying attention to, what is the implication of this on the analysis of the eye tracking metrics? And for example, should we exclude eye tracking data where we know that student wasn't actually paying attention to what was being gazed at?
I think this is a great idea to do that. So actually look in detail at all of the stimulated recalls and exclude the eye tracking data based on that. However, I think the problem is that students or test takers don't always tell us all of their thoughts. So I think there would still be some invalid data in the final sample, even if you exclude it. So I think, again, if you want to interpret eye tracking data on listening studies, it would be a good idea to back it up or triangulate it with other types of data, such as stimulated recalls.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you, Franz.
Thanks.
So in the interest of time, I'm going to ask Xia and Guoxing. Well, they have received two questions. I'm going to just say the first one here. It's from, sorry, I haven't recorded who has asked the question, but anyway, when I have used W and I in writing classes, students shared the same frustrations. Sometimes, no matter if the sentence is good, the algorithm still flags the sentence as having an issue. this might be stylistic chunks that the corpus data behind the algorithm is trying to suggest to the writer. In the instances, it is, as you found, I, as a teacher, can give attention to the revision that the student, with the student to talk about. I think the idea is that sometimes there are some red flags, but in fact, there are like false positives, meaning that although something is identified as a mistake or an error, but it's not in reality an error or a mistake. Can you tell us a little bit about that, Shah and Guoxing? Okay, so Shah, yourself are going to answer that?
Yeah, so I have just addressed the question by Malik, I think, in the chat box, but I would like to elaborate on what you just talked about in terms of the false positive. We also evaluated and investigated the nature of feedback AWCF provided by Write and Improve, which we didn't get to present today. And in terms of the accuracy of feedback, among the three types of feedback, like indirect word level feedback, direct word level feedback, and indirect sentence level feedback, it's interesting to know that actually the feedback on the sentence at the sentence level was most accurate. And based on the coding of two coders, we found that 90% of the indirect sentence level feedback was accurate. And I guess that's why among my participants, it was found that they highly trusted the sentence level feedback. They were highly engaged and then really wanted to, just as Malik mentioned, they really wanted to make the page white, the feedback page white. However, the cognitive nodes associated with such kind of revision just got them overwhelmed at a later stage. And that's why some of them at the end of eye tracking just stopped revising to such kind of indirect sentence level feedback. In terms of the word level feedback, the direct feedback was found to be something around 78% accurate, when around 20% of recall rate, means the system can only identify 20% of the errors, which would be identified by by teachers or human raters. As for the indirect word level feedback, the accuracy rate was much more lower. It was something around 30% of precision rate, and again around 10% of recall rate. That's why in our study, we recommended that there needs to be more direct feedback, and there also needs to be further improvement of the indirect word level feedback. Yeah, I hope that answers your question. Thank you.
Wonderful. Yeah, that was a wonderful answer. Thank you very much for that. So if I may direct the other question this time around to Russ. Russ, you actually talked about test strategies, and one of the questions that would cross my mind is the question of reliability and validity of tests. So here is a question that has been asked by Warid, and I think it's for everyone, but I think I would like to ask you the question. Will the challenges of using eye tracking mentioned in all studies affect the validity and reliability of the findings in any way?
I think so. So the thing with eye tracking, I guess, yeah, eye tracking can allow us to look at the response processes, which I think is essential because we, in the field, I guess, in general, we focus, at least from what I see, we focus so much on the test scores, and we perform different statistical tests to analyze those test scores without oftentimes looking at what the test takers were doing while they, before they arrived at those scores, right? So I think eye tracking, if we look at what's happening through eye tracking in terms of the response processes, that will give us additional data that can help us identify, for example, as I tried to demonstrate in my study, the amount of guessing that's happening, which definitely affects then the scores. So I think it's another, as Franz mentioned, triangulation is of eye tracking data with other types of data is essential. We can't take eye tracking data for its face value. that I-mind hypothesis, for example, does not, again, as Franz shown, it doesn't always hold true. But if we combine it with other types of data, it can definitely shed a lot more light on the test scores. I hope.
Wonderful, thank you. Thank you. One last thing, or last question to wrap it up. I wonder if Guoxing is around. I wanted him to wrap up everything for us. Guoxing, are you around? Okay, thank you for sharing yourself.
Thank you,
yeah, thank you. I was, Guoxing, just a quick question. I was wondering how, as an expert in this field, how do you see the future of eye tracking in language assessment? Do you think that it's gonna go up and more researchers would become interested in using it? Or do you think that researchers are gonna lose interest in it?
I think definitely more publications, as in the first few slides you have shown, within the field of applied linguistics and language testing in the future. The reason is that it always takes time to get one project done and get it published. So it takes a long time, maybe kind of a 5-year cycle. So I'm kind of confident that more and more publications will appear in the major journals in language assessment. The stuff you have been doing very actively in Singapore, and some of the projects we hope to collaborate, but because of COVID-19, it seems to have some negative impact on what kind of data we might be able to collect. Okay, so I'm very confident that we will have more publications. But I also actually want to make one comment. It was a question to friends, I think, about people staring at the center of the screen. That's kind of a natural tendency that people would do when you turn on the computer and you look at the center of the screen. So in one of our projects, we actually force the participants quite naturally to look at the corners of the screen. So we don't put the stimulus in the center. So in a way that they have to make some effort to look at areas that we want them to look at. There are some kind of side effects of that, but I feel that overall, it really can solve the problem of, people have natural tendency looking at the center of the screen. So answering to your first question, I've done that. And also I had a bit of sort of additional stuff on that I was thinking. So friends, thank you very much. And also thank you to all the participants. Over back to you, Fahid.
Thank you very much, Guoxing. That was a wonderful note. I really enjoyed listening to you wrapping up everything and making a comment about what Franz had observed in his study. So the last question for everybody, does anyone else like to say anything else before we pass the time to Chris? Any of the presenters? Any last words? Okay, it seems that everybody's happy with what we have achieved so far. So Chris, over to you. I just wanted to thank everybody for staying with us in this wonderful evening. And I hope to see all of you in person one day after this COVID-19 is over. Over to you, Chris.
Thank you very much, Fahid. That was an incredible symposium, actually. It was, I mean, just looking through all the questions in the chat box just makes me realize how rich everything was. And I just feel that it was really, really worth our while, setting this up and for everyone to take the time to be here. So I'm personally delighted about how everything went. So thank you very much for being an excellent and amiable host as well. And before I end the meeting, I'd just like to post in the chat box some links to our upcoming events, New Directions events. So these are calendar invitations. I'll just share these here. Okay, so yeah, I just posted the Google Drive links. So if you want to put the upcoming New Directions events into your calendar, it would be great if you could do that. And as well as that, we also have a survey, a very short survey, which if you could complete, that would be wonderful. I will also post the survey.
Yeah, great. Yeah, I would also hope that everybody will attend to that survey and answer the questions. We really look forward to having your feedback on that.
Yeah, indeed. And I just posted the link there. So it's on the TCS lobby platform that we've been using. So there's just a few questions on that, and it would be really interesting just to get all your feedback, because the attendance for this has been excellent. So with that, I'd like to bring everything to a close. Thanks once again to everybody for participating. And the next symposium is on the 23rd. So we hope that many of you can attend that one as well. Okay. So thanks very much, everybody. I'm going to end the recording and then end the meeting. So have a wonderful day.
Thank you, everybody. Goodbye.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
You.
Thank you. Bye-bye, everybody.